My name is Roma. This is Zimlove, a podcast about Zimbabwe. Here I'm sharing interesting stories through people that I've met and want to show you a side of this country that an internet search cannot. Enjoy.
I think the thing that's very clear to me is that I'm not an Indian. I think this is the thing that has become very evident in terms of the separation between having been born here being Zimbabwe, being second generation Southern African, and the ways in which we were brought up and the kind of our sense of traditional culture.
This episode is with Heeten. Heeten did a documentary about the Indian community in Zimbabwe in 2001. And he's here to share his knowledge, his experiences, and his personal story with us. Welcome, Heeten.
Thank you, Roma.
Would you mind briefly introducing yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name is Heeten Bhagat. I currently operate as an academic. Right now, moving between 3 countries, Zimbabwe, India, and South Africa. And I work primarily kind of at the edges of academic thinking, so much more kind of in an experimental space and what's coming into itself as a kind of transdisciplinary practice.
Nice. Well put. I'm going to jump ahead with one question already because you are now working in India, but you were brought up in Zimbabwe and then you're in South Africa. And now there's this connection back to India. How is it for you working in India as somebody not from India in terms of where you were born and raised?
I think the thing that's very clear to me is that I'm not an Indian. I think this is the thing that has become very evident in terms of the separation between having been born here being Zimbabwe, being second generation Southern African, and the ways in which we were brought up and the kind of our sense of traditional culture, as it were, but also understanding of space and sociology. So it's been fascinating traveling through India. The experience has been complex. A lot of foreigners who go to India come away with this kind of awe. It feels like they've kind of found nirvana and sort of heaven. That's not been my experience. I think it's been fascinating and overwhelming. And like I said earlier, very clear about where I am from.
That you're from Southern Africa?
Yeah, I'm not an Indian.
Because I was born in Poland, but I grew up in Germany. So when I go to Poland, it's a very different experience because the way I was brought up, it's like I'm in a time capsule, right? With the traditions and the language and how I behave when I'm in Poland. Though I do speak the language and I can navigate to a certain degree, it's just a foreign country. But at the same time, being Polish-German helps me being in Zimbabwe because Zimbabwean culture, it's closer to Polish culture than it is to German culture.
That's fascinating.
And going back and forth with German-Polish culture helps me a lot going back and forth with Zimbabwean German culture here. Is there anything specific you can point to?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we look at the condition of being an immigrant, I think, especially in the early 1900s, when my grandfather came across, the idea of coming to settle and make do was necessary, but at the same time, the things that we understand with a lot of immigrant cultures is the thing that they had to hold on to was their culture. So to a large degree, what they come across and what they set up in other lands is a kind of quite an idealistic form of their culture because it's the only tie they have to an identity. And so to a large degree, one of the things that I encountered when I went across to India is really how static our sense of culture has been. To a large degree, it's quite dated, and what my grandfather practiced and my grandmother and my parents in India feels quite archaic, quite retro. And in a kind of country where the predominant culture is, for want of a better word, it's a very kind of broad generalized term, Indian. There's a dynamism and culture evolves because it's secure in itself. It doesn't have to pay too much attention to its identity. Whereas in other lands, when you are a minority community, then you have to hold on to something and you have to keep a frame. And so those sort of mutabilities, those changes are not necessarily encouraged.
Yes. Not even in a community. I remember my parents were not part of a Polish community where we grew up, but they still, this micro universe at the privacy of our home still stayed. And when I was a child, when you would go to Poland, you would kiss 3 times. And now when I go, once I turned 14, nobody does that.
No.
People my age and younger are like, oh, my old aunts used to do that. It's very archaic, like you say.
And there's something kind of quite romantic about it too.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that at the same time, as much as that is a fixed static entity, growing up in Southern Africa, certainly the older generation held its culture quite securely. But those walls and barriers start to shift a little bit with the next generation, and then shift even more with the third generation. And so those kind of structures, in a way, don't hold true. And I mean, in a very obvious way, I have a very different sense of my cultural background than my grandfather did, which is why India feels so foreign.
Of course.
Yeah.
When we talk about the phenomenon that what can happen as an immigrant, especially when you are part of a community, that this culture gets frozen, what then might happen is you get protective of that culture, you protect it from outside influences, and this is not just part of your identity, it's also where you draw your network, you draw your strength, and you want to marry your children for them to stay in the culture, to preserve it the best way possible. And that might lead to maybe even some kind of isolated feeling for the second generation. How was your experience with that?
Very different. Very, very different. I mean, I think I'm lucky and kind of blessed to have had 2 parents whose parents, my grandparents, were very invested in both my mother's and my father's broad education. So unlike a lot of local people of my parents' generation, both of them were sent to the UK. My mother was sent to Eastbourne and my dad was in London. And they both had education there. And so this is something that my parents encouraged amongst us. A little bit to their detriment, because my family, I have an older sister and a younger brother. We are vastly different. So there's a sense of kind of being more globally oriented than to be sort of isolated as an Indian, you know, and to hold on to your identity. But I also think that this kind of conversation on a broader level is an interesting thing, that back in the early 1900s, the point of migration was primarily to do with economics, right? And so there wasn't necessarily a condition that you had to assimilate. And so you came in, you did what you did. The kind of politics of immigration were vastly different. People were exploring the world, right? And so the notion of colonization then comes into play. And that's where the kind of the notion of justice and appropriation, those sort of conversations start to begin. The condition of immigration today is much more about assimilation. So you hear about people who want to move to the global north are required to learn the language and the culture. And to a large degree, we are entering into a period where immigration is not something politics is championing anymore. There's a sense of closing the borders.
And do you feel, in terms of the Indian community here in Zim, do you think the experience that you had growing up here, it's an experience for the whole community, like an opening up, a more globalized citizen, or does the Indian community behave in that sense of assimilation or isolation? How do they interact with the majority?
It's a good question. It's a really good question. And, you know, I think it's something that I encounter quite a lot. And I think more and more so, these kind of broad general questions are quite difficult to answer. Because no matter how large a community is, there's a spectrum of experiences. You know, I have very dear friends and connections within the Indian community here who would identify much more and be more comfortable in India than I am. And that's because they held culture, the Hindu culture, I should say, they've held that to be central in their lives. And so that puts them closer and a little bit more able to assimilate to a life in India.
You're Hindu.
Not practicing.
But your
brought
family.
up as, yeah. And so I think to answer the question, I think there was a spectrum. And I think that if I think about it in the conversations I had, I think it's primarily because my parents had the kind of privilege, I guess, to have a life somewhere else. But both are trained professionals. My dad was an engineer, my mother was a midwife, and lived for, sort of important formative years of their lives in London. Mm-hmm. And so understood another kind of immigrant life. And so that kind of richness that they bring to us as their 3 children kind of multiplies in our experience, in a way. We have relatives and friends whose parents never left the country. Mm. And also people my generation and the younger ones who've also never left the country. I mean, they've gone on holiday, but I've lived in 5 countries now. Mm. And I don't think it's going to stop, really.
No, I hope not. Mm. Although I do think Zim is a good place. For me.
Why so?
It's a beautiful place. Just the aesthetics of it. The trees, the light, the flowers. Mm-hmm. It is beautiful. Mm-hmm. And it's very easy to go out even when you have a bad day and to have a chat with the cashier. You go to work, the secretary is amazing. So funny, so nice. You have a chat with the students. And it's very easy to walk up to somebody and have a very nice chat. I appreciate that pairing with the weather and the nature. Yeah, I feel rich. I don't know, maybe we have some numbers about the religious diversity in the Indian community. But myself, I know most Indians here are Hindus, but I don't know if there's a temple or if there are festivities. I've personally never been invited to a home when there was a ceremony happening. Is it just me?
I think you haven't been here long enough. I think it's important to kind of distinguish something here. When I speak about the Indian community, maybe I should start with the Indian community in Rhodesia. So the first kind of known migrant, this is only through the kind of history books, to settle that is because the Indians from the Gujarati coast have been trading with communities along the Zambezi River from as early as sort of 900 and 1100. So there's evidence of that. There was a trade between gold and silk. There was a lot of gold in this country. There was a famous quotation from a politician post-independence in Zimbabwe said that most of Zimbabwe's gold got melted on the funeral pyres in India. It's kind of a beautiful idea because people were cremated with their jewelry. And so that sort of gold would kind of be embedded into their bones. It's kind of very beautiful as an image. But the first known economic migrant came around sort of the late 1800s. The exact year is quite difficult. And he was called Bhimji Naik. And after him, a lot more Indians came. The surprising thing about the kind of population of Indians in Rhodesia then is that from what we can gather, they all came from about a sort of 30-kilometer radius around a town in Gujarat called Surat. And partly this came about because of several different reasons from what we can gather when we kind of looked into it, with the understanding that, historical documents are by no means conclusive or definitive. They can only tell a particular slice of a story. So what we understood is that there was a drought in Gujarat around that time, and the new world was kind of opening up. And so people came across. The important distinction to make is that when we speak about Indians as migrants, this includes both the Hindu and the Muslim population. The exact numbers are difficult to discern. To a large degree, it felt kind of equal, and there was certainly a lot of cohesion between the Hindu and the Muslim populations who were living then primarily in what was called Salisbury, the capital of southern Rhodesia. And then, there were other groups of people who moved out into the kind of smaller towns, primarily as traders.
Mm-hmm.
So the other difference is that also the kind of Indians that came from India to Rhodesia were primarily economic migrants, different to the population in Durban, for example, who are indentured laborers.
So then what were the main professions that were being picked up at that time?
Mostly trading.
Mm-hmm.
They would set up shops, which is something that has kind of followed most Indian kind of histories. From what we understand about my father's father is that he came across and worked in a fabric shop. And one of the entry visas we have as kind of physical proof is from 1912. We feel that this might have been his second or his third entry, because in those days there was no birth certificates. We didn't really have a sense of how old he was when he came. And so he was one of a group of pioneers that set up what was then the Hindu Society.
Mm-hmm.
Around that time also the Muslims set up their structures, their cultural structures, like a kind of mosque and all. And, there was a temple that was built in town, the original temple.
Mm-hmm.
There was also an original mosque that was built.
Are they both still here, still operating?
Yes, the Hindu temple, the original one, is still there. It's in the center of town.
Mm-hmm.
It was something I remember kind of growing up and going to. And we lived around the corner, so we lived in the center of town in a block of flats. The Muslim community built their mosque later on. The original mosque is also in town. I think it still exists. I mean, I can see it in my head. I haven't been down to the center of town. But both communities then built other temples and mosques closer to where they live. And so those both exist in a suburb called Ridgeview, which is near Belvedere.
Is this also where a lot of people from the Indian community are staying? Because I know people that live in Belvedere. Yeah.
But it has also kind of expanded. I mean, the origin of the Indians being in that suburb was that it was part of a kind of Group Areas Act during the Rhodesian days. So primarily most of the Indian families first lived in town. So around the roads are now Kagubi, Cameron, Leopold Takawira, those sorts of roads, Harare Street. But there was a point in the kind of, I think it was in the late 1960s, the Rhodesian government gave the Indian community an option to move out of town. And they chose Ridgeview because it's closer to the industrial areas. And by then, the Indians had started opening up businesses.
I think people from the outside, they're not really aware about how the governments at that time operated in terms of black, white, Indians, colored people. You know, how racism played a role in these times. Can you just tell us a bit about that?
These questions are really good. And the thing that must be very clear about a lot of the information that I'm sharing is a very particular point of view from what I have read. And I think that, this idea that history is held authoritatively by someone, I think is kind of so. I just want to kind of make that clear.
Of course, that I understand.
One of the things that was attractive for Indians to come to Rhodesia at that point, especially from where they came from, was the possibilities of them being able to be part of a second class, not necessarily the poor class or not necessarily obviously the colonizing class, which is the white people. Most of them came primarily from kind of villages and lower down in the kind of economic class system in India at that point in the early 1900s. And as was the case, people came, and because of that condition and because of a particular kind of enterprise, entrepreneurship, they were able to earn money quite quickly and enjoy a more kind of privileged life than they could have built in India.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a particular ceiling in the caste system. It's super complex and really irritating to kind of understand.
Is the caste system also valid, let's say, here?
Yeah, it was. It was. But the thing is that it was only pertinent within the community. From the outside, Indians were Indians. You were brown and you came from India, and so that was it. You were second class. Nothing was going to be restricted of you within that limitation, right?
So you would marry then in the same caste, for example, inside the community.
That was the condition. But that shifted quite quickly from my grandparents' generation to my dad's generation. My mother and father from different castes. And that started to become, it wasn't a kind of central thing, but there were elements of that. And then come my generation, people married outside of the state. So so we are Gujarati, but there are people who are Punjabi, and there's Tamil, there's Malayali, there's Maharashtrian, there's people from Kerala. So India is hugely complex. And in my generation, people have now married outside of the Gujarati. So, Gujarati Punjabi, Gujarati Tamil, that kind of thing.
Has this dynamic developed in India? Because I can imagine that this happens here because the community is smaller than, of course, in India. So maybe the community at some stage is just opening up because there are just so many people in your age group that you actually can marry. So it would be easier to stay in your own caste in India.
Again, like a fascinating question, because, certainly we are entering an era in the world right now where those sorts of freedoms are being peeled back. I think we're entering into an era of a kind of right-wing conservative thinking that is fixated on a kind of false set of purity. That still exists quite a lot in India. The kind of lesson I learned when I was in India recently was that these kinds of cultural laws and mores, as it were, are still being held, unfortunately. In 2025, in India, there is the evidence of the caste system, and intercasteal marriages are still something that is difficult. It's not that it's not happening, but people really struggle. And again, it's on a spectrum. I think it requires you to be from a family that what we say is open-minded in a way. But that sort of provincialism and those sort of conservatisms, unfortunately, still endure. For me right now, I think they're being fueled very much by politics.
Also here.
Yeah.
In Zimbabwe.
Yeah. It's such a complex thing. I think the challenge that a lot of young people in Zimbabwe are facing right now, especially when they come to the point of wanting to be married, is finding people who want to come and live in a country like this. Because India is going through a renaissance, premised on a notion of finance mostly. So there's this idea that, India has gone through this kind of growth spurt since 2015. The success of India right now is mostly driven by the fact that they say everybody's earning lots of money and the country has enriched itself. And so if you're a young man or a young woman and you're wanting to get married to somebody of your caste, the pool to choose from in Zimbabwe is very small. The pool to choose from in Southern Africa is also quite difficult. And so if you want to stay within those structures, then you look back to the kind of the mother country, as it were. And Zimbabwe doesn't sell itself very well overseas, right?
No, this is what this podcast is for.
Yeah, it doesn't sell itself. It doesn't sell itself at all. I think that you're unique yourself, Ruma, in terms of the ways in which you have come to understand the value of being here. I think it's not so evident for lots of people. And I'm sure you kind of recognize this amongst your students.
I do.
And so the caste system is still very strong. And I think it'll get stronger. I think being able to think outside of those structures requires a lot more effort and stamina, which I don't think people have.
So the caste system is one thing to separate us humans from each other. The other thing might be the religion. Do you know a number, how many people with Indian heritage are in Zimbabwe right now? And what is maybe the share of Muslims, Christians, and Hindus?
I'd be wary to put any number against it, but I think right now, because of economics and the way the country's going, there are a lot more Indians from different parts of the Indian subcontinent. Whereas previously we sat primarily as a kind of Gujarati population, we have a lot more people from Tamil Nadu, from Kerala, from Maharashtra, and also Pakistan. This also has to do with a sense of being able to understand the economic benefits of being in this country. Mining has become a big thing. And so lots of people have come in there. The IT industry has also kind of fueled a lot more migration. So the original population of Indians, for the most part, have either passed on or emigrated. I mean, I'm an interesting example. My entire family live in America. So my parents, my brother and sister emigrated to America about 20 years ago. And now American citizens or passport holders, and they stay there.
But I think there is a number in the documentary.
Yeah, at the height of its population, which is kind of around the 1970s in a way, the Indian population never numbered more than 10,000. This is Hindus and Muslims.
Really?
Yes.
Wow. So the documentary was in 2001.
Yeah.
But now you said there might be a new wave of people from all over India and Pakistan have been coming because of different reasons.
And I would say right now, I think the Muslim population outnumbers the Hindu population.
Okay.
Yeah. That's at a kind of glance, as it were. But also, I know that in the years from 1998 to 2003, the Indian population decreased massively because of the unstableness of Zimbabwe, hyperinflation and all. What is interesting to also kind of note is that people who left here didn't go back to India. They went to New Zealand, to Australia primarily. And so you can go to towns in Wellington and Auckland, Brisbane, Melbourne, and you will find pockets of Indian Zimbabweans, Zimbabwean Indians, whichever. And they set themselves up very similarly. You know, they kind of form networks. It's quite beautiful in a way. The care networks and the kind of community connections endure across different countries.
It is that you have these big parts in your family chronology, that it's such a big part living in Southern Africa for generations. There's something that can bind you together, because then there are certain things the others understand that maybe people that have been in Australia for much longer, maybe they can't connect.
It's really interesting because it does blur the meaning of the notion of family in such an interesting way. You know, this idea that you may be a different caste, you may be from a different economic strata, but the fact that you were born in Zimbabwe means that when you move across to Australia or New Zealand, because the common denominator is that you're from Zimbabwe, is the means by which you connect.
And it is so special. It's such a orchid.
So the numbers are a difficult thing. I mean, I think there's no census.
And when you say largely, it's now the Muslim community, then the Hindu community. So I guess then the smallest is the Christian Indian community.
Very, very small.
Yeah. I met a girl hiking and I was like, wow, you're the first one that I've met an Indian with a Christian background.
So those were, in the kind of original days, those were the people who came from Goa. And so Goa is a small state on the west coast of India, below Maharashtra, below Mumbai. And they came across also sort of as economic migrants. It's a fascinating little community. I mean, we were connected to them. They were tiny and now even tinier. But also in the 1980s, we had people move across from Sri Lanka. And, you know, in a society like this, the fact that you have brown skin doesn't distinguish you as being Indian or Sri Lankan. You just kind of get seen as the same thing.
Yeah.
And primarily a lot of the Sri Lankans who moved across were Christian too.
And is there any cultural interaction between the religious communities?
Not particularly. And I mean, I would say this at a distance. I think there certainly is a essentializing that's happening amongst the Hindu communities and the Muslim communities. I think the cohesion that existed in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, probably 70s, between the Hindus and the Muslims in the Indian community mostly started to separate after independence in this country, with the kind of arrival of people of Asian descent from Pakistan, from different parts of India, because they bring with them a particular kind of understanding of the edges of society in a way. It's like, I don't know how else to describe it. Is that, you know, I think certainly the Hindu-Muslim divide after partition grew very strong in India between Hindus and Muslims. And that was further exacerbated by the current Indian government, BJP government since 2015. So the kind of vilification of Muslims in India is a awful and insidious thing that's still quite active. And I think that comes across. You know, when people from India come here or when people from Pakistan.
It's interesting to look at that, to see that whatever happens in the motherland influences the way the communities work in the diaspora.
Exactly. I mean, Islamophobia is awful in general.
Absolutely. What I see with my parents, because the older they get, the more Polish TV they watch. What I see with them a lot of times is that they distance themselves from extreme right-wing Polish politics. I see, oh, you've now been living here so long, you're now quite liberal. And when you look at like a strong right-wing politics in Poland, you can't identify with it anymore. For you, it's all foreign now. So
I think your parents are unique, for sure. I see a difference in people who are my parents' generation. I think this is primarily because of the internet. I mean, the thing is that at that age, you're not able to control what your news feed is.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it's that kind of insidious. I don't think it's out of choice. I think it's just mainly based on the fact that they are being herded through a particular set of information.
They still watch a lot of TV. They're not so much the internet people. So maybe this is also, a reason why they get a bit of different information rather than when you just scroll. But is there anything in particular you would like to share, maybe even concerning the future when you see people are emigrating or the community being more parted now or the community getting smaller? I mean, it's hard to look into the future, but what do you think the Indian community going to look like in just a couple of years?
In terms of the work that I'm doing, or I have been doing for a little while now, is really very much understanding what it means to have the capacity to imagine. I think that that's one of the things that central politics anywhere in the world is trying to take away from people. I think conservatism and right-wing thinking are very much about embedding a very particular way of thinking and being in society. And to some extent, it's pitted against left-wing thinking or kind of liberal thinking. But I think what we're lacking right now are spaces to imagine alternatives. At the same time, when we see examples that are around the world right now where a revolution is caused in Nepal because young people understand how to use the internet in a very creative and extraordinary way. And they cause the change of a government. I think that's fascinating to watch when we have a candidate for the mayor of New York who is diametrically opposite to the central politics of that country. And that person, because they make a particular kind of sense, have the ears and the minds of people. This is all kind of embedded in the period by which central politics in most countries is being conditioned to understand immigration is a bad thing. I'm curious to see how much stamina that exists, because already we're seeing in different parts of the world that historically immigrants have always benefited countries. People come in, they work hard, they know that they're there because they need to make a life. Nowhere in history has it shown that immigration is a bad thing. Politicians are maybe spouting rhetoric out of facts that are untrue, that rile people up. So, immigrants are tied to crime and corruption, but that's a useful smokescreen to be able to shift people's attention away. And so the short-term outcome of this move against immigration is going to play out in countries because really immigrants are the ones who hold a lot of the kind of services of a country.
But what do you think of
Zimbabwe? I don't think a lot of people are trying to move here. Unfortunately, I don't think the country sells itself very well.
So you think the community is going to diminish?
The Indian community?
The Indian community, or maybe just the number of people living here in general?
I think Zimbabwe is a hard sell, in terms of if you are an immigrant, if you're an Indian immigrant, I mean, if we kind of narrow it down to that, if you're in India and you're thinking, I want to go somewhere else, Zimbabwe is not top on your list, unfortunately. But at the same time, the people who have moved here in the last 10 or 15 years have done really well. And so it's a difficult thing to say. So economically, potentially, but I'm not sure how many more minerals we can extract from the country to be able to feed that economic kind of success. As a quality of life thing, people would understand that they have a better option somewhere else. I think for them to be able to see the value that you're seeing, those are not high on their priority list. It depends on your priorities. I think that if what you're wanting is community and space and nature, yes, Zimbabwe is. But young people and new migrants are looking for money and enterprise and wealth. Yeah, Zimbabwe is not really the place unless you're willing to be a proper hustler, like a real hustler. Yeah. So I think certainly the kind of the community of Indians that are here right now see the value and they are making lives here. They're investing in here. Whether that's going to grow, it may grow partly through procreation because people are having children. I think the future is so unstable. It's unstable in the sense it's very hard to predict. You could align a whole bunch of facts and say, if we go via these trends, this is where it's going.
Yeah.
But those trends change.
All the time.
All the time. So there will always be Indian people in Zimbabwe. That's as best as I can tell you. Right? Yeah. How many? I don't know.
The name of the podcast is Zimlove.
Yeah.
So what I ask every guest is about what Zimlove means for them. Any kind of story, maybe a song, maybe a saying, something that happened to them, anything that maybe grasps that kind of feeling that I call Zimlove.
I was born here. I grew up here. The first part of my life was kind of through Rhodesia. The middle part of my life was through a new Zimbabwe. The later part of my life was around the collapsed Zimbabwe. And I left here 10 years ago with the sense that I was looking for something else. And because of circumstances around politics and stupidity of politicians, I find myself back here. What is astonishing and very heartwarming is how readily my community, my family, welcome me back. It's endearing. How, even though you left, there's a space for you. And if we think about it in an analogy as a dinner table, my space was always there. And so I was able to come in and sit right back down again and join the meal in the most extraordinary way that I have not felt anywhere else.
That's beautiful. Thank you very much, Heeten. Thank you for being my guest.
Pleasure.